In the early days of their spaceborne expansion, the Tau made little distinction between trade and conquest, for both offered opportunity. Their heavily armed and armored trading vessels served them well in early conflicts, blazing a trail of expansion that has never been guttered. And now with your rise to Koro, it is time for you to lead the foray of the Tau merchant fleet, for the Tau Va and the greater good. Hello there everyone. It is time to look over the Tau Empire and the first of their fleets, the Tau Merchant Fleet. And at a glance, it can be hard to truly appreciate what the Tau Merchant Fleet has to offer. For the Tau Protector Fleet, which is the more militarized version of the Tau naval ships, seem at a glance a lot more powerful and a lot more impactful. They have higher speed than the majority of their cruisers, they have access to the same auxiliary ships, and even the majority of their macro weaponry, their railgun, is a lot more easier to utilize due to the fact that it's all fixed towards the prow, in some sense or another, due to the fact that the majority of their weapons are either turrets or already affixed to the prow. Whereas the merchant fleet have a lot of broadside weaponry, they're hindered a tiny bit due to the sheer amount of launch bays that are available to them, if not secret missiles. And never mind the fact that most of their ships are even slower, as made apparent by the unique trait of their light cruisers, which are just as slow as a handful of battleships in the game. So it can be tricky to see the appeal in Tau Merchant Fleet, but they still have some good stuff going for them. For one, they have perhaps the cheapest battleship in the game, and this is almost true when you consider even the grav hooks that it's inflating the points. And what the grav hooks basically does is it brings a handful of frigates in along for the ride. More specifically the Orca frigates, which are kind of the 200 health frigates, the lightest you can get. But they serve their role as a scout without you having to include them to your fleet. And even with the grav hook, these things are just under 300 points for a ship that technically carries 4 fighter bays. So you can easily get a good handful of these, and if you so wish, you can get 4 of these battleships in the fray. And that hands down makes them the fleet with the most fighter bays to bear, if not seeker missiles to bring into a battle. They may not have a lot of raw firepower in their macro weaponry, but they have a ridiculous potential in burst damage, provided you have a good understanding on how to get the most out of these ordnance weapons. This complements well with at least the Demiurge, which are one of the auxiliary factions you can include with the Tau Merchant Fleet, for their cutting beam and torpedoes emphasizes the need to kill things quickly in a lot of scenarios. However, the cutting beam does require charging up on asteroid belts, so it can be a little bit problematic at times, but they are designed with that in mind, to ambush, jump a target, and ideally destroy before they have a chance to really retaliate. So there is a good synergy there with the merchant fleets and the sheer amount of fighters they have at bay. For the Tau Protector fleet, at most can only get like 12 fighters to bring, and that's including the fact all their fleets are all protectors, with maybe one emissary that's bringing also launch bays to the fleet. In this case, you have access to 16 fighters if you wish to go that route. And a lot of the times you will be utilizing these to overwhelm point defense, overwhelm any fighters that your opponent may be using, and then bringing your bombers and seeker missiles over to do an overwhelming wave of destruction on your ships one at a time. And ideally bringing your Manta bombers back to do repeated assaults. And because both the seeker missiles and the bombers are basically global range, you just need to set it up by having vision of the target and ideally your fighter bays to kind of distract your opponent. But that doesn't mean the cruisers and the light cruisers are no joke. It can be a little bit tricky to utilize them due to, like I mentioned before, their firepower is kind of weaker in general to the Tau Protector fleet, but when you consider the fact that their health has not been punished, they have the same health as the Imperial Navy and Chaos fleets, they still can make effective ramming ships, especially in the case of the hero, the Largi. With the adaptive deflector on his prow, you can do substantial damage even though you technically don't have a spur equipped on this thing like the Imperial Navy. If anything has lower armor than you, or you're facing off against Eldari or anything that's fragile, ramming is a very strong option here. And they are technically the fastest ship in the Tau Merchant Fleet, so they are at least best equipped to do that for you. And this synergizes well since the seeker missiles are also affixed to the prow, but one of the Explorer battleships have a unique trait where their seeker missiles actually shoots from the side. And this can add a little bit of awkward dynamic for trying to use these in a large fleet with multiples of these type of battleships. But when you're considering the potential of 8 seeker missiles, especially with multiple battleships launching these, you have the potential to rip apart ships at a glance. You just need the fighters to provide distraction, which I'll explain a little bit later on in the video as we get into the gameplay itself. Otherwise, I'm only going to glance over a lot of the other auxiliary ships, as they're also going to be mentioned for the Tau Protector Fleet, and that's going to be the Crew War Spear, which essentially is just your wall. It has no like burst damage of its own, it just has a lot of macro weaponry, which have actually a tracking element that I won't emphasize on the description of the weapon itself, but it is not possible to dodge these weapons outside of its range, so when facing off against frigates or Eldari, these things are going to be pretty damn reliable, and never mind the fact these are going to be ridiculously durable due to the fact that they are immune to suffering any of the component critical hits at least, and they have the heavy armor all around. Never mind the fact that they have 360-degree boarding arc, so you will be able to do good boarding damage, which helps complement the fact that the rest of the Tau Merchant Fleet are really bad in close with their troop numbers and their boarding damage. So this will help at least distract and weaken the ships, while the rest of your fleet hangs back in safety, even if it's just taking the boarding damage as opposed to dealing it. You will need to take a good look at all the individual ships, mind you, with like I said, since the merchant fleet themselves are not very good at boarding and they have very weak morale, at least weaker than normal, so they are prone to causing mutinies if your flagship is not alive throughout the majority of this battle to try and rally everything, or if you're not making good use of the encouraging speech ability itself to kind of offset that fact. You could find yourself, even with the sheer durability of your fleet, you could be in trouble with morale and just boarding in general. These are your main weaknesses, especially when facing off against Space Marines or even Tyranid fleets. And last of the auxiliary type ships, we have the Nikasar Dao, which is a bit of a pricey frigate in comparison to a lot of the other ships you have at your disposal, but they come bearing perhaps the heaviest macro weaponry in the game for a frigate, in that they have 2 broadside weaponry that even these individual railguns are more powerful than even the railguns of the capital ships themselves. And when you include the fact that they have a ridiculous turning radius speed of 50 degrees a second, even not including the high energy turn, it can be really easy to have both broadside weaponry engaging a target. This is a little bit impractical though, but it allows these ships to evade ramming and combat very easily, and you can use these kind of like a support ship for the majority of your battles, if you are going to utilize one. Now, while I emphasize the fighters and the seeker missiles as probably being the main strength that the merchant fleet has to bear, they are technically, when you have a look at the individual bombers, not really all that different. In fact, I would even go so far to argue as the Manta bombers, the Manta missile destroyers, are potentially weaker than all the other bombers of the Imperial Navy, at least the generic type of bombers. For that, they only do 90 points of damage with a single bomber per squadron, whereas Imperial Navy, the Demiurge bombers, have access to 4 of them that do 30 damage each. Sure, the hit points of the Manta Destroyer is buffed up so it's comparable to 4 of these squadrons, but it's still only doing the damage as 3. So it could be an easy argument that they technically are weaker than all the other bombers in the game. They're just a lot more reliable, and with the sheer number that you have available at your disposal, it can be easy to get amazing value out of these things with continuous runs. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the seeker missiles, the fighters, and how to get the most out of them in a battle. For it can be really easy, really damn tempting to just launch your ships across the map, identify your opponent, and then just prime them for destruction afterwards, but you do need to take a lot of consideration when you do this. For one, the gas clouds and asteroid belt, and an opponent knows how to use these to conceal their ships, then your fighter bays are gonna, more than likely, as they're traveling over there, gonna lose their lock, and then they're just gonna circle around and leave themselves open to attack. They're not gonna shoot down any point defense even if the cruisers hold their position while you dance around them. And considering the fact you only have 3 charges of all your ordnance, These are really damn valuable, and these are going to hurt you in the long term if a fight drags out. So a lot of the times what I like to do for at least the start of the match and for scouting purposes, if I feel confident I can keep vision for the mid game where there's no gas clouds near the central objectives, I probably will send only a single fighter bay to kind of launch behind where my opponent deploys at. And the reason this is important is that there's only a very limited time where the point defense are going to shoot down your fighters. They may still get destroyed, mind you, so in some situations you may want to use the battleship if you want to survive. And then they'll just dance around away from their fleet while doing the identification you're looking for, so that way you can prioritize your targets. And they'll sit there for 9 seconds and then they'll make their way back. And this is important for even your fighters, that if they survive the trip back, you will get refunded on their charges, which is kind of the most important factor of really any type of fleet that's utilizing carriers. But due to the merchant fleet's reliance on them, it is essential to try and keep everyone alive unless you know what you're getting into. So this is a good way to at least identify the cruisers and battleships. For light cruisers and everything else are going to be a lot more hard to keep track of. And ideally, they don't have the point defense to shoot down your fighters on their own unless there's a clump of them. So you can easily use these to kind of either fly over an objective or at least in the way of where an objective might be if you're expecting to encounter a light cruiser or frigate. And this will give you a little bit ample vision if you don't want to use your own frigates, which mind you are some of the slowest frigates in the game, equal to that of the orc frigates, mind you. So they're not going to be ahead in fighting off these frigates a lot of the time. They're going to basically be coming in at almost the same point as a lot of your battleships or even cruisers. And then once all the ships are identified, you're able to prioritize what you want to go after. And depending what you're fielding, if you're all battleships, just for a simple example, as this would be the most amount of fighters and bombers you have access to, the critical mass more often than not will be able to easily overwhelm any type of fleet you go up against. The only few notable exceptions might be Tyranids, since they can recharge their ordnance to kind of overwhelm your fighters at a certain point, and maybe like Adeptus Mechanicus, due to the higher number of point defense they have access to for all their ships. Other than that though, every other fleet, even if they are a carrier fleet, is probably going to be more expensive than your ships, so you can overwhelm them. It's just the point defense of their cruisers that will be the equalizer, that will eventually whittle down your fighter count if you're not accounting for it properly. So ideally, in those type of circumstances, if you can't just brute force your way with a fighter squadron, or half your squadrons being fighters and the second half being manta bombers behind them, what you'll probably want to do is launch a small number of fighters ahead of your bombers and secret missiles, especially the secret missiles, since these are going to be your most impactful type of weapons when utilized properly, and use the fighters to distract the point defense just long enough for your bombers and secret missiles to go in there and do the damage necessary. Do keep in mind that there is an armor piercing potential for both the bombers and secret missiles, so if you're able to hit the side or at least a vulnerable portion of the ship, this will amplify the amount of damage you're doing and potentially cripple, if not destroy, the ship you're focused on. You just need to commit a certain amount of fighters to it. Normally, a 4-fighter squadron should be good enough depending on what you're up against, so a battleship with its 4-fighter squadrons alone could seal the deal for the rest of your secret missiles and bombers. Or you could just use 2 of your heroes if you're utilizing them to kind of serve as bait. But ideally, if that's not a problem, it's really simple to just group up on like 2 or 3 different ships and shoot down their point defense, leaving the rest of their fleet pretty crippled in their ability to shoot down your bombers and secret missiles for the remaining portion of the battle itself. And a lot of the times this will help ensure your fighters even survive if they're effective, especially if you want to go with the critical mass route, and by that I mean launch every single fighter you have, the sheer number of them, and with the point defense, if you can have all the fighters come in at roughly the same time, the point defense normally will be firing at different squadrons and making it really difficult for them to focus fire and shoot them down one at a time. Which is a lot of the reason why you want to spread out your fighters to like multiple cruisers, not only for shooting down the most amount of point defense you can, but also so that way the ships are shooting at different fighter squadrons. Hell, just a lot of battles that you will come up against, just 3 cruisers or even like a battleship and cruisers, is easily over half their point defense if you can destroy all the defense turrets that they are utilized with. It sounds pretty simple in a nutshell, but like I hinted at earlier, if they can conceal the ships in any way at all, this does ruin your attempts to attack them at long range. So scanner pulses or even like a beacon and certain gas clouds or asteroid belts that they happen to be near helps limit that amazingly, unless they want to put themselves in a very precarious position away from an objective, or even ideally spreading out their fleet to kind of protect their vulnerable ships that you just crippled. For the more spread out they are, the easier they are to deal with for you. It's just the travel time you have to account for, and arguably this can make the merchant fleet lose a lot of their power and flavor if you're facing off against an opponent that knows how to deal with these fighters. The gas clouds and the asteroid belts concealing your ship is kind of like the easiest way I mentioned, but a lot of the ships, due to the fact that the Barracudas themselves have 500 unit speed, almost all the ships that go 200 unit speed can easily outrun these so long as they have their all-ahead full active, and this protects their point defense from being shot down while at the same time shooting down your fighters over time. And if you are trying to combo this with seeker missiles, there can be a little bit of a mechanic the opponent can use against you where the seeker missiles are actually moving faster than the Barracudas themselves. So if they can boost away from the fighters long enough and ideally get out of range with their point defense on the fighters, then the point defense will start shooting at the torpedoes themselves, and those are a lot more easier to shoot down. Or hell, if they have any fighters or torpedoes at all, this is another trick you need to be aware of. If they fire torpedoes to kind of bait away your fighters even briefly, the point defense will automatically target the bombers or seeker missiles that they are trying to protect. This is where I'm afraid the long-term longevity of the merchant fleet could falter a little bit. You still have the overwhelming fighters to a lot of times not really concern yourself with that. If they have no point defense to shoot down your seeker missiles and bombers, then this is really no issue at all. You just don't get refunded your seeker missiles if they happen to conceal themselves, so fission is probably the most important factor when utilizing the seeker missiles in general. For the bombers will be able to return to your capital ships for return runs, but the seeker missiles need to be used deliberately. And I talked about how the Demiurge is amazing at complementing this. When you consider the Demiurge prow has the 83 armor much like the Hero Cruiser, they are more than likely wanting to get in your face. Never mind the fact they have torpedoes and the cutting lasers, which are both ideally best at short range. They have the prow armor to kind of take these hits in close, and on top of that do a good amount of ramming damage to complement your fleet. So they are going to do a lot of damage for you. Do keep in mind though that the Stronghold just has more torpedoes and just heavier macro weaponry, and not really more cutting lasers to include, or not, at the very least, not a more powerful cutting laser. So if you are planning on using one of the Demiurge, do keep in mind what you want to use it for, if it's going to be for the cutting laser or just the raw health and firepower that it has to bring to your fleet. Now I did utilize 2 different types of fleets for my time with the Town Merchant Fleet, and while I used a kind of like a mix of 3 heroes and 2 carrier explorers, the main reason I use this fleet is due to the sheer durability that the heroes have to offer. I only miss out on 2 fighter bays, but it includes 15 seeker missiles for the burst damage potential on any isolated ship or any vulnerable ships I can hit with. And just the sheer extra armor of these heroes cannot be overlooked, for like I said, they are mostly going to be a wall and they are good for ramming and doing damage to complement with the seeker missiles. They are to protect my 2 battleships and ideally soak as much of the damage as possible. They work well, it is simple and efficient, even though their railgun macro weaponry isn't all that impressive even in comparison to the battleships. They're mainly there for the ramming and close range engagement, while still complementing very well the need of heavy ordnance. It's a very simple strategy, and I definitely do enjoy it, although due to the fact that all your ships are just weak against boarding in general, you do need to make preparations for when the close range engagements come. So call to arms you want to keep handy if you feel your opponent is utilizing all the boarding on a single ship to help mitigate your one weakness there. And then otherwise, keeping the flagship safe for the convenience of boosting up your morale is going to be really damn important for those close range engagements too. Since even though the durability is outstanding with the extra health pool that these ships have compared to the protector fleet, you will fall apart when ships start having mutinies on you. So pay very close attention to the status of your deck, for if they get temporary damage or even destroyed, this will rapidly destroy your fleet, if you are not watching for that. Now, my second fleet that I've been utilizing with during my time with the Town Merchant fleet is going to be emphasizing more on the auxiliaries, and it has been a fun fleet as well. I would argue a very different type of playstyle, even though the heavy reliance on ordnance and burst damage is still there for your fleet. I used the Explorer Borkon, 2 Bastion Demiurgs, and a Croup War Spear, which can very easily be substituted for a Bastion at almost the same type of cost. It also has another hero. This one's equipped with more lance weaponry, mind you, to kind of complement the heavy lances that the Borkon battleship has to offer. But there's some very easy tweaks you can do there if you enjoy the Demiurge and the burst damage too much. But the hero serves technically the same kind of role when you consider the Borkon and the hero have a plethora of secret missiles to also do some burst damage and chipping damage at range. It also still has a nice complement of fighters for what I described before at distracting for the bombers and secret missiles for you. They're just not going to last nearly this long due to the lack of this critical mass. But they still easily serve the role you need of denying their fighters and bombers and open up windows for your secret missiles and your own bomber attacks, if utilized properly. You're going to be using this fleet more for the raw firepower and the burst damage, although with the Demiurge it does require you to be using asteroid belts to charge up the cutting beam, which can leave a lot of very awkward positions for you. For a lot of the times the asteroid belts are going to dictate where you're going to deploy at. You're not going to have the convenience of just going towards the centralized objectives, so unless you have the ideal starting points or the ideal of deployment for the map, you will a lot of time be forfeiting the objectives, at least in the early portions of the match. But that's not a huge issue when you consider the fact you're going to be killing things immediately when you do get that beam charged up. And with the inclusion of the heavy secret missiles on the battleship, do keep in mind that this fires the secret missiles on the broadside, which is why the Croup War Spear complements this well, I feel. It goes the same speed as the battleship, while not really hindering its firepower anyway for that same reason. The secret missiles, in the proper situations, the proper engagements, will just circle around the Croup War Spear and completely protect your battleship. Although, if you are going with a heavy auxiliary fleet, it can be a lot easier to just use a light cruiser and solid run it. Keep it back there for the majority of this match, but by then I would kind of make the argument that a protector fleet might be more useful in that regard due to the fact that their light cruisers are faster while still having the same access to the solid running with the Watercast Diplomat. But in this situation they complement each other very well, and the Croup War Spear is meant to be your wall. It can be a bit tricky to move, but there's a nice little mechanic to the Croup War Spear if utilized properly that allows it to rapidly change its direction without it having to be slowed down. If you do like 90 degrees, or hell, you can potentially do like 135 degree turns almost, this will rapidly change its direction without it having to stop first, as opposed to if you were to do a complete 180 degree turn and then boost, you will have to wait almost twice as long before it actually changes direction. And this can be very problematic, for one of the big weaknesses of the Croup War Spear would be like stasis bombs or any type of bombs in general, as well as Nova cannons that basically ignore the armor that the Croup War Spear is providing for you. So being able to utilize this to either mitigate a lot of the damage you're taking or just straight up dodge them is pretty damn significant once you get it down. It can be easy to forget, mind you, because of the chaos of battle itself. It's a nice little trick to add to your repertoire if you are going to utilize the War Spears in any sense. But ideally it's meant to protect the battleship while using its lock-on to help contribute some damage when the actual fight itself is beginning. But like I said, if you don't care about the battleship, or you're just going to use the light cruiser, you can easily swap these out for more demiurge for the sheer damage potential itself. For an extra demiurge will easily replace the seeker missiles and the bomber potential that the Borkon battleship is bringing to this fight. Now we're going to talk about some of the skills that are very important that you should consider for the town merchant fleet. And it almost goes without saying, if you're expecting any type of long-term fight, long drawn-out battles, the repair drone is almost essential. It is hands down the best ability for repairing a fleet in the game, and there are very few of those that actually are in effect. Hell, with the 6 hull points a second, even the Necrons, try as they might, I don't even think can possibly get this kind of repair. Unless they want to hide in a gas cloud, have their stance that increases the repairs, and even then, I don't even think they can break 6 hull points a second. So you are putting Necrons to shame in that regard alone, almost. And with 3 charges, this will have amazing potential if it can hit the majority of your fleet, since it does have a 9,000 unit range. So there's nothing but good things to say about this. Just try not to use it too early, too preemptively, for it can be very easy to overlook the fact that it's reducing the hull value, your maximum hull value, by 2 points as it's repairing. So even if you're taking light damage, if you're not accounting for that, you can have some odd situations where the ship's not being repaired at all. But hey, if it's taking that little damage, that's probably not a concern at all. Experimental railgun shot helps emphasize the burst damage, and it helps give you some sheer firepower for your flagship itself. Since sadly, your demiurge, your crew war spear can't have access or can't be the flagship of your fleet, so it's up to your town merchant fleet to kind of bear the brunt of this responsibility. It can be an incredibly difficult shot to aim in the heat of battle, but with 300 points of damage, it's going to be worth every shot that hits, especially when it can go through all ships. The multi-spectrum probe can help when fighters can be a little bit too tricky to get vision for you, especially when you're facing off against like Eldari or anything that's reliant on solid running. This will at least protect your flanks, or at least get vision of objectives. So that way, if your opponent decides to get the objective, you can start pummeling them, or at least have fighters primed to get vision of them for you for your follow-up assaults. Any solid running type of faction can be very problematic though, just because if your fighters are not on them, it's very easy for them to lose their lock, and then they're very vulnerable to either just floating out there and getting shot down, or you have to wait a full minute for your fighters to recharge to try and get vision again. It's a bit of an awkward matchup, and this probe helps alleviate some of that until your frigates are in position to provide that vision. Stasis bomb, it goes without saying, since your fleet is pretty much the slowest fleet in the game, to help offset that, why not slow down their fleet to ridiculous portions? Mind you, it will slow down the speed of your seeker missiles and your bombers, so you need to use this responsibly if you are trying to use it to set up for a vicious counter-assault. So this could very easily harm you as well as benefit you. It's just a matter of playing it out properly. The gravity wave projector is a bit of an odd one, but it is good at keeping ships away that don't have high turning capabilities. It has uses against orcs when they're flying towards you, for it turns them, depending on how close they are, it basically turns them 90 degrees and it pushes them back a good 1,000 or 2,000 units, depending on their size and how far away they are from the wave projector itself. The main reason I bring this up is it basically has a 60-second cooldown, so you will get a lot of use out of this, but with how close you have to get to utilize it, this may not have a lot of value for when you're being overwhelmed. It's good at keeping like 1 or 2 key ships at bay, so that way you can make your escape. Now for some of the upgrades you should look into and seriously consider, depending on what fleet you are utilizing there. The experimental thruster manifold is almost essential for your fleet, for I talked about how the stasis bomb is really important at keeping enemies at bay. This will allow you to offset your speed bonus, if not completely. It will have you down to 145 unit speed, which is still slower than most other like Imperial Navy and generic type of fleets, so they still can outrun you if you let them get close enough. But with its additional speed and the fact that it applies to all your ships, including your demiurge and your crew war spear, This can be really damn useful for those that aren't hindered their reduced speed, and actually can make them really damn potent at chasing down vessels. In the strobe field, which can complement this really damn well, when you use your all hit full or high energy turn, this basically reduces the accuracy of your opponent. And this makes it so that way even at point blank range when you normally can't avoid macro cannons or any type of weaponry at all, this allows you to have that defensive potential. It does require to be using your gauge, so it's not the most convenient all the time. For if you have enough distance on a ship anyway, you can easily dodge the macro cannons the majority of the time anyway. So this is primarily is most effective when you're worried a close range engagement is inevitable. Watercast Diplomat, this is the last upgrade you get access to when leveling up a Tau Merchant Fleet or even a Tau Protector Fleet, and this is essential, hands down, for any type of auxiliary fleet that you are going to be relying upon. It may not be as necessary if you are using only a single auxiliary ship for your fleets, but when you're heavily utilizing them like I did with my 2 Demiurge and Stronghold fleet, this will make or break the effectiveness of that fleet. For so long as the flagship is still alive, which I hinted a little bit on having your flagship either as a light cruiser and just solid run and hit in, this will almost zombify your Demiurge and Crew War Spear. There's only one way to get rid of them, and that's by killing them. A Mission Dissipator, this will allow you to get into the middle of the map relatively quickly with very little risk. For it augments all your ships in the fleet, and technically this will only be practical for the frigates in the early portion of the game. For later on, if you can keep your cruisers and your ships hidden or near a gas cloud, it will be really good at preserving your fleet and protecting them from longer range fire. You will just need to deal with the frigates somehow, which can be the most problematic type of ships to get rid of when you're relying on a bunch of bombers and seeker missiles, mind you. So, in comparison to like the Chaos Fleet, it'll be a lot harder to get value out of this for the longer term engagements. Thank you everyone for watching this video. I hope it's been helpful, and at a glance it does look like the Tau Merchant Fleet has a lot to be desired, but there is some hidden value in the sheer durability they have, as opposed to the Tau Protector Fleet. Although, as players get more experience and know how to deal with both the fighters and to just avoid bombs in general, be more effective at dodging Nova Cannons, plasma bombs, and anything that ignores armor, the value of the Merchant Fleet will diminish a slight bit in comparison to the Protector Fleet. For that's the main benefit the Merchant Fleet has as a whole, is their sheer durability, which makes them more resilient for those type of attacks. But at the same time, those are things that can be avoided and negated to an extent. So in the long term, we will have to see how the Tau Merchant Fleet handles the test of time. Thank you everyone for watching, and I will see you on the battlefield.